will have here from IBM US, from Washington DC, I think so. Then we have Robert Ryan, he's from IBM Global Services. He normally works in the strategy and change line of business, and then in the area of working mainly, he has more than 25 years working in this area, so doing service, something related to service management and IT governance. And he now is going to talk us about integrating COBIT and also ISC 38500 with IT service management. In this case, this is making a plus for Robert Ryan that comes here. Thank you very much, Robert.
Yeah, I joke my personal bias is I live in the real world, so I have a lot of clients that come to me and ask questions about ITIL and ISO 20000, and the whole question they always have is, what are they and why do I care? And then how do I apply them in the real world that makes a difference? So I personally have not been involved in the development of some of these standards. I spent the last couple of years talking to a lot of people who are on the committees developing the standards, and it's really a fascinating process as I've learned about it, how ISO and IEC go about developing standards. And it's also interesting how the frameworks have evolved, so both the ITIL framework and the COBIT framework. So what's happening though is the ITIL framework is being updated. The COBIT framework, which is currently COBIT 4.1, is being updated. So both ITIL and COBIT are going to come out in new versions in 2011. Simultaneously, the ISO IEC 20000 standard is being updated and is going to come out in a new version in 2011. And on top of that, COBIT 4.1 is also coming out in terms of integrating into ISO 38500. So the ISO 38500 standard is coming out in a new version in 2011. So all four of them are going to change at the same time. And the intention of all of the changes to the four standards is to make them come together and work together as one common standard. So we'll talk just real briefly about what our standards and frameworks, so we have a common reference, and talk about ITIL version 2 and version 3, which I know in a lot of quarters you can't say that it's just ITIL, so there's not going to be in the future a version 2 or version 3, they'll just and talk about how that links to ISO IEC 20000, and I'm also going to ask some questions, so looking for some feedback. Partly when I give these presentations, it's a fascinating process where I also learn, and last year I've traveled a lot around the world, and it's really interesting how 20000 and 38500 and ITIL are being adopted in very different ways in different parts of the globe. So if I go to certain parts of the world where people are in ITIL version 2 and it's still very new to them, other places I'll talk about ITIL version 3, people like move on, we know all about it, let's keep going. So, and then talk about the ISO 38500 standard, which in my experience traveling around, not many people know about it, not a lot of interest in it yet compared to the interest around ITIL and the interest around ISO 20000. And talk about currently we're in COBIT 4.1, it's going to move to COBIT 5. So the professor talked about the COBIT framework, and he also talked about VAL IT. So ISACA has a suite of products, COBIT 4.1, there's a VAL IT framework, there's a RISC IT framework, and a number of other frameworks. So COBIT 5 is going to combine the existing ISACA frameworks into one. So to me that's quite an undertaking to take VAL IT and all these elements of IT governance and combine them into a process framework. And we'll talk about COBIT 5. And then probably just talk about the planned updates that I was saying in 2011 all throughout the presentation. So the question people always ask is, why do you have standards? So one of the underlying assumptions of ISO and IEC is that a standard is good. So standardization is a good thing. So working with the IT community, having standardized processes, having standardized approaches is inherently a good function. So one of my clients in the United States is the Food and Drug Administration. So Food and Drug Administration approves new drugs to the market. And one of the big things that the FDA does is look at clinical trial data. So a lot of debate in the clinical trial world is standardization of your clinical trial records good. So an underlying assumption in this presentation is that standardization is good, and that's part of the function of ISO and IEC. So, at the very bottom I put a reference to a book. There's a gentleman in Australia who helped develop the ISO 38500 standard, and he has a book about how the ISO 38500 standard works. So it's a good reference if you're in charge of doing any type of ISO 38500 implementation. So, and I talked about briefly, so you talked about the standards. So ISO and IEC have standards. Different from a standard is a framework. So ITIL is a framework, And COBIT is a framework, so there is a difference between the standard and the framework and the way they operate. And we'll touch on that throughout the presentation. I just want to bring that as an assumption that standardization is good and there is a difference between frameworks and standards. So on ITIL V2, so I didn't put any slides in on ITIL V2. So V2 comes out, it's essentially 11 processes, or it's 10 processes in a function, depending on how you look at financial management. So ITIL version 2 is not a life cycle look at IT, it's not an end-to-end system. So it's a set of processes. So ITIL version 2 comes out as a set of processes. And a number of people, probably a number of people in this room, have certification in ITIL at an individual level. But as ITIL, especially with V3 coming out in May of 2007, got a lot of traction, and ITSM became more of a hot topic, people started going, well, how do I get certified as an organization, not just as an individual? So the ISO IEC 20000 standard is focused on IT service management. It is not certification in ITIL. It heavily links to the ITIL framework, but ISO 20000 certification is about organizations getting certified in IT service management. That said, realistically, they completely overlap, and in the marketplace, most people think ITIL and ISO 20000 are completely related. So ISO 20000. So a lot of organizations are getting certified ISO 20000. So there's two parts to the standard. So there's part 1, which is this formal specification. And so the elements of part 1 of the ISO 20000 standard are required to get certified. And in here is a number of processes. It's almost a hybrid between version 2 and version 3 of ITIL. It's a set of processes that you have to meet certain requirements in to get ISO 20000 certified. There's a second part to the ISO 20000 standard, which is a code of practice. Now what the rules say is the code of practice is recommended ways of implementing IT service management. The clients I have that are getting ISO 20000 certification realistically meet both parts of the standard. So skipping a little bit to what is going to change, there is a committee right now that's working to update the ISO 20000 standards. So ISO and IEC have a joint technical committee, and they're going to update the standard in 2011. So one of the potential updates to the standard is added in part 3. There's currently part 1 and part 2. So if you're getting ISO 20000 certified, there's an audit process. So there's talk in the update of the ISO 20000 standard about adding in part 3, which would basically be guidance to organizations in terms of how the audit would occur and how the audit process can happen. So potential for a third part to ISO 20000. But the part that probably we're most focused on is on part 1, and I've talked about it as a set of processes. So you see in here, there's requirements for a management system, planning, implementing service management, newer change services, service delivery, and then there's groupings of relationship processes, resolution, control processes, and release processes. So that's a diagram of part 1. So, and what you see in here is basically, if you talk about processes under COBIT, they're referred to as domains. So if you take a logical grouping of processes, that's a domain. So there's 5 domains in the ISO 20000 part 1 standard. So that's what you see up here, is those 5 domains. So you have the service delivery domain, you have control processes, release processes, resolution processes, relationship processes. To me, that looks a lot like ITIL. It does not directly map one-to-one to the ITIL version 3, but it certainly has a lot of common elements in terms of a process framework. So there are some differences between the ISO 20000 standard and ITIL. A couple really minor ones. The ISO 20000 standard takes continuity and availability management and combines those into one process, whereas ITIL breaks those out. And up here on the budgeting and accounting, in the ITIL framework, we're talking about accounting, budgeting, and charging. You don't see the charging component of the ITIL framework in ISO 20000. So, relatively minor differences between the ITIL framework and the ISO 20000 standards. In control processes, so a lot of these are just different ways to group, logical grouping of processes. So what don't you see in part 1? So what I don't see is IT governance. We've been talking heavily about IT governance here. So I see a little bit on alignment to the business with the business relationship management process. And in service level management in some of these. I don't see strategic planning. I don't see anything at a higher level governance. So the standard tends to be more immersive, focused down at the process level. So quick question, is anybody's organization in the room ISO 20000 certified? IBM, so So according to the IT SMF, which runs or used to run one of the certification standards for ISO 20000, there's basically 700 organizations in the world that were ISO 20000 certified. So I have a great debate with a colleague of mine who says that that's about all that's ever going to happen, that ISO 20000 is going to peter out as a standard and that certification is not going to be a big deal. I disagree with that. I think ISO 20000 is going to continue to be a standard that's going to be adopted, continue to grow in the next several years. But the reason we have a difference of opinion about the ISO 20000 standard is why we get it. So the perception is a lot of organizations that have gotten ISO 20000 standard are external or managed service providers. So they're organizations where you outsource your IT functions to. They're not corporations or companies or nonprofits or universities. So the perception of the standard is basically used as a certification tool by third-party service providers. And if you look at the 700 or so companies that have gotten ISO 20000 certified, a number of them are in Asia, a number of them are managed service providers out of Asia and India. So the question is, are corporations going to start adopting ISO 20000 or is it going to remain the standard more for managed service providers? Now, one of the things about the 20000 standard is it's not a life cycle view. You don't see the ISO version 3 life cycle, strategy, design, transition, operation, continual service improvement. So it's a set of processes. But woven into the ISO 20000 Part 1 standard is Deming's Plan, Do, Check, Act framework. So there are a number of folks who argue that the ISO version 3 lifecycle actually maps to the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So there is a lifecycle view somewhat woven into ISO 20000 and the Deming framework. So challenges, and the reason I'm bringing that up is what you start seeing throughout these standards is everybody's saying the same thing. Everybody's saying it in a slightly different manner. Part of the intent in 2011 of all these updates to both the standards and the frameworks is to get some commonality here. So are we on the ISO version 3 lifecycle? Or is a Plan, Do, Check, Act type of a framework also a way to look at IT from a full lifecycle perspective? So that's part of the thinking of updating some of the standards is making those kind of changes. So this is a little bit about the certification process. So up till recently, IT SMF ran most of the certification schemes for ISO 20000. And this was the basic process. So start with a questionnaire, an application for assessment, a pre-audit initial stage. So I mean, a lot of pretty normal stuff. If you've been through ISO 9000 certifications or if anybody's been through Deming and the Baldur's Quality Awards. So I think the most relevant thing is the recertification happens to happen every 3 years. So once you get ISO 20000 certified, it's about a 3-year cycle to keep getting certified. So there is a refresh annual at 20000. But the bottom part is the one that I find people struggle with the most. So IBM, we have 400,000 folks. We are not ISO 20000 certified. We have a number of components inside the IBM organization that are ISO 20000 certified. So we have a managed service piece in China. We have a managed service piece in Taiwan. So a number of different places. And the way you go for certification is you have a scoping statement. So a scoping statement is basically the second sentence there. So a service provider gets certified in part or all of the services that it delivers for a specific country or a specific customer. So I work a lot with the United States military, so there's sometimes pressure working in the U.S. about being certified ISO 20000 just for the United States Air Force. So the U.S. Air Force just put out their first solicitation, tendering from consultants basically requiring ISO 20000 certification for anybody who applied against that tender. So starting to get traction, maybe not quite there yet. So, and this is what I was talking about a little bit about the benefits of the ISO 20000 certification schemes. The companies that I've personally worked with that have gone for ISO 20000 certification usually are global companies. So it says that the ISO 20000 standard fits an organization of any size and shape. I think the reality is that in general you're going to see ISO 20000 certification. It's going to be a focus from international corporations that deal with international markets. So I was at a conference, IT SMF conference in New Zealand. There was a gentleman there from a company called Dairy Farm. So Dairy Farm is in China, and actually, even though its name is Dairy Farm, it actually runs all the Starbucks and it runs a bunch of retail organizations in China and Hong Kong. So and they got ISO 20000 certified. So I was really intrigued why a corporation, internal IT service organization, not providing services in an external manner would get the ISO 20000 certification. So, and the IT director there said we think it's important. It presents a quality standard to the world that Dairy Farm takes IT delivery is important. It is an enabler of the business, so we think our business customers will care that we're certified. So really fascinating as to what the benefits are of certification, but the second one is the one I've seen the most, which is entering into global markets and providing a competitive edge. So it also does help in terms of forcing or creating standardization. In this brief, I was going to mention APMG now is the only certifying body for ISO 20000. It's an interesting change. It's always interesting how standards evolve and how they get adapted to organizations. It's interesting, I was on the ITSMF website just to see how many companies in Spain were ITSMF certified under ISO 20000, found 7. But then people said to me, well, in Spain, there's actually a different certification scheme that's used in terms of the ISO standards. So I found this was really fascinating. I was talking to somebody in Ireland who said, yeah, in Ireland, we don't get ISO 20000 certified for the ITSMF scheme. We're now APMG. We have our own certifying body in Ireland. So the whole point of that is be careful that you get certified by a legitimate certifying organization. There are many alternatives in how you get certified. So how do you keep up? There's changes, as I was talking about, in all 4 of the 2 frameworks and the 2 set of standards. So how do you keep up as to what's going on? So ISACA and ITIL and OGC, a number of organizations put out press releases talking about the updates. As the updates are done by committees, there's also exposure drafts that get circulated. The way I keep up on it is through LinkedIn sites or blogging sites. So often members of the committees that are working on the updates actually post comments in the blog sites about how the development is going. So this one I took off a blog site recently. So Linda Cooper is one of the editors of ISO 20000 Part 1. This is some information she put out on the web. I found this pretty fascinating because it talked about final stages of revision of the standard. It only gets released to members of the committee and national standards committees, and how it gets released planned for spring 2011. So ITSMF had a conference last week in the UK, and so Linda presented at it. I wasn't at the conference, so I'm kind of intrigued to hear the updates in terms of how the standard development is happening. But if you want to follow what's going on in some of the developments, as well as the formal postings to the sites, you can also pick up a lot of information. Let's talk a little bit about ISO IEC 38500. So the topic that's been the hot topic yesterday and today was IT governance. So the professor was talking about, he mentioned the ISO 38500 standard, 6 components to the standard, which I'll talk about relatively briefly. So ITIL was pretty much heavy acceptance, ISO 20000 gaining a lot of traction. So ISO 38500 is a standard for corporate governance of information technology. So I think a big nuance, and the professor talked about it, was what is IT governance, which is typically the CIO and the senior leadership in the CIO level from the IT organization, and what is governance from the corporate side, so the board of directors level. So one perception of ISO 38500 is this is a standard for board members and senior leaders on the business side to manage IT, which is somewhat different than the COBIT 4.1 framework from ISACA, which is maybe a little more focused at the CIO level or at that management level. And there's a number of folks from ISACA who are here today and in the conference, so also good to just check around with some of those folks in terms of updating to the standards. But a lot of debate and updates is going to happen about what is governance and what is management. So Ivor was saying to the professor that governance is the management of management. So other people say that governance is basically the direction from the owners of the business about where you're going, and management is a set of processes and procedures and how you get there. So different layers in terms of what is governance and what is management. I think what really confuses people is there's a lot of talk about governance from the corporate level. There's a lot of talk about management. And I want to start talking about the COBIT 4.1 framework, which is management focused. So what is IT governance, which seems to live in the white space between corporate governance and the management level. So as you're using the term governance for IT at the CIO level, a lot of what people refer to as IT governance, I often think of as really management processes. So this is governance. So this is one definition or set of definitions. I didn't create this, but I agree with a lot of this. So second bullet is the key one. So governance is not management. So governance is setting the direction, having overall vision, and having the ownership. management is how you implement that. So, and I work hard at the management level. So governance in all these planned updates and throughout a lot of the literature is clearly becoming more of a focus, but a lot of what is in the ITIL framework and a lot of these ISO standards is really management. So governance is not a set of shackles or business controls. So the idea is not management is punishment and a lot of policies and procedures that are unnecessary. So governance sets the direction, but management should implement it in a way that helps achieve the objectives and that keeps the staff motivated and keep people engaged and engage the stakeholders. So I think the last bullet is one of the other themes that probably coming out of this conference and you're hearing more and more about. So a lot of these standards didn't talk about organizational design and the organization and how people interact. So there's more focus in the ISO 38500 standard on organizational change management, how to engage people in the processes, what is appropriate behavior. So if you're in the management consulting side of organizations, this is great. ISO 38500 is the people side, so the organizational alignment. So I think what you'll see throughout all these standards is a little more focus on organizational design. So processes are great for people, process, technology. We got the technology piece down, and this is about focusing on the people piece. So if you're going to have processes, how do you put them in an organization that works in an effective manner? So we'll talk a little bit about organizational change management. So skip that. I'm a consultant. I got to have pretty graphics. So the professor had the 6 elements of 38500. They're basically up here in a different picture. So strategy, acquisition, conformance, performance, behavior, and responsibility. So those are the 6 keys of the 38500 standard. So what's missing? So I saw the 38500 standard. It's only 15 pages long. First question I ask is, how did you get 6? Because immediately what jumped out at me is, where's risk? Where's value? So COVID 4.1 and the ISACA products talk a lot about value frameworks and risk frameworks. Why in my 6 elements of 38500, which is corporate governance, are those missing? And the answer was, I tracked down the guy who helped develop the standard down in Australia, and he basically said, you can have an unlimited list of things. This was a lot of smart people. Spending a lot of time talking and discussing about what are the key elements today to make corporate governance work. So it's an interesting discussion. So let's talk about the 6 components real quickly. So conformance. So corporate governance. So I work for the U.S. federal government effectively, or consult to them. So conformance is a big issue to me. I have to be in compliance with laws, whether it's laws on privacy, security, a lot of government regulation, auditing standards. So basically, you're at an issue there about conformance. So ISO 38500 is be conforming with your regulations. So strategy, you've heard enough of it. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's the alignment to the business. So acquisition, again, this is where terminology starts tripping me up. So because when I read acquisition, I thought, you're going outside the IT organization to procure and really know that acquisition is all about any kind of money that gets spent in an IT organization, even internally. So again, I'll start touching on the subject of the standards are a little inconsistent in terms of terminologies. And then responsibilities and behavior. They're really interesting to me in ISO 38500. This really talks about the human angle. So what's the appropriate roles and responsibilities, the assignment of roles, the term delegation of authority. The owners of the governance basically delegate their authority to employees and management. So a lot of talk here about the organizational change piece. In performance, I'm not going to talk about that. That's almost dwarfs the standard. That's all the things about managing day-to-day activities in their IT organizations. And this is just sort of a little more on the 6 elements of the 38500 standards. But again, I saw a mapping of this which brought in the risk and the value elements. But this is an interesting standard. So I haven't seen any focus in my clients in the U.S. on this standard yet. So somebody said it's what's old is new again, and this is bringing around the whole topic of corporate governance. So I think standards take a while to get adopted and get understood. So I think if we're at this conference 2 years from now or 3 years from now, there'll be a lot of talk about the 38500 standards. And somebody made the comment when I was at a conference. They basically said, yeah, standard is great, but it doesn't become real until people put a body of tangible knowledge around it. So a lot of people in my industry and consulting are out writing books and figuring out how to take the 38500 standard, which is reasonably high level, and take it down to more tactical. And this is the other piece of the 38500 standard. So apologize for the color on that. So. But it talks about evaluate, correct, and monitor. So these are the three other big components of the 38500 standards. So we talk about updating the standards and the links when the ISACA, when they put out COBIT 5, my understanding is it's going to have, as part of that framework now, evaluate, direct, and monitor. So you'll see those three components of the integrated COBIT 5 updates, which are going to come out next year. So. But this is the view of evaluate, direct, monitor. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. This is a good diagram. This is for your standard stuff. Now I'm going to start moving over a little bit to COBIT. I've probably spent much more time in the last couple of years on the ITIL standard and implementing or adopting ITIL. Another discussion whether you implement ITIL or whether you adopt ITIL. So. But my clients are real interested in ITIL. The U.S. is real ITIL crazy. Even I work with military organizations, the Navy, the Marine Corps, all about how do we get ITIL adopted, how do we get ITIL compliant. So even though they're not organizations, they're going to focus on basically any kind of certification. But this is a COBIT definition of IT governance, so we're moving a little bit from corporate governance in the 38500 standard down to COBIT. So I'm going to skip some of this. One of the key things here is basically the ITIL framework is OGC. So the ISO 20000 and 38500 standards are ISO IEC. So you got OGC, you got ISO IEC, and then there key elements of your COBIT is ISACA and the IT governance system. So pretty amazing to me that you're going to take all those standards and frameworks simultaneously in 2011, try to coordinate them when you're doing it across multiple organizations. But a great effort. So a lot of this. I'm going to skip to a little bit short on time. This is a key slide I wanted to cover, which is the planned updates of COBIT 5. So I took this again off the site. So COBIT 5, so basically under COBIT 4.1 was a process framework, which is focused on controls. I think the professor covered that in really good detail. Obviously COBIT 4.1, ISACA has a number of products, a suite of products beyond just what's in COBIT 4.1. Among them is the VAL IT frameworks. Getting back to my 38500 when I got my VAL here. So there's the RISC IT framework. So there's an initiative about taking governance forward. There's another ISACA product about board briefing on IT governance. This is really focused at the governance level. So, and the business model for information security. So another thing that I was a little surprised to not see in the 38500 standard was security. My whole world is cybersecurity because I work a lot with military organizations. So. But the idea of COBIT 5 is to combine all these elements together. So COBIT 4.1, VAL IT, RISC IT, IT assurance framework, where we're all going to get combined in the COBIT 5 framework. So that's a big undertaking. That's a pretty big re-engineering of the COBIT framework. So now the intent of ISACA, my understanding is that basically the update to COBIT 5.0 is going to link directly into what's in ISO 38500. It's going to link into the ITIL framework, so, and it's also going to link into the ISO 20000 standards. So the point of this presentation is to get you updated a little bit. A lot of people are talking about COBIT and ITIL. This is what's going to change in all these different frameworks to make them come together in a way that's going to be effective. So we basically risk the COBIT 5. So what struck me immediately about COBIT 5, is there a risk if you try to take all these different frameworks and publications and put them into one large integrated framework? I've heard a lot of debate about that. So I have a lot of clients who are going, well, how do I implement COBIT 5 when it comes out? Because it's got all these different elements into its large scale, it's all encompassing, it's end-to-end. So I think what you're seeing in general, though, is a consolidation and more integration. So IT organizations I don't want to deal with ITIL, ISO 20000, 38500, and a variety of other standards as standalone, separate activities. I want to use them as one integrated framework. So COBIT 5 may be an answer to achieving a lot of those objectives. So, but it's interesting to see how this evolves. I've only seen the exposure draft for COBIT 5, so they've posted it out there. There's also on the ISACA website updates. It's nice that members of the committee also are at a number of these conferences, so we can pick their brains in terms of what's going on in terms of the updates. So a lot of these originally were planned for spring 2011. I see dates somewhere in the second half of 2011. They do seem to be within the next years. So you've got a lot of good stuff going on in terms of the ITIL framework. I'm not going to say any updates to ITIL or 3.1 or version 4. It's just ITIL. So, but these are going to be some of the changes you're going to be seeing in the next year. So you're good where you're at. You've heard a lot about how to handle that. question is how it's going to keep changing down the road. So since just we have a minute or two, we're going to go back there. So one of the things the professor said that I thought was interesting in the VAL IT framework is 22 processes. COBIT has 34 processes. So it'd be interesting to see in COBIT 5 how all this is going to get integrated and be consistent. So just as I've been pointing out, many of the lifecycle approaches are going to be consistent across the standards, and how are you going to be using that same language on a day-to-day basis. So, and in a lot of ways they do. I mean, I have a lot of definitions and terminology. So 5 minutes left. I probably riveted you with the world of standards and frameworks. Is there any questions? Okay.
I really appreciate the presentation, clear, some ideas, but I see a lot of frameworks going on, and where will this lead us to? And even from the point of view of the client or the supplier, we have to help our clients, but are we going to put all of our people certifying in COBIT, ITIL, V4, V5, whatever, and tell the client, no, now you use this framework, that framework? I'm confused.
Yeah, no, and the intent was not to confuse you. I think the intent of all the frameworks and the standards is to create one common framework and come through in the next few years. So the intent is to avoid having, I'm ITIL Foundation certified, I'm COBIT certified, my organization is ISO 20000. I think really Osaka almost has the lead in here in the COBIT 5 framework. Let's try to pull it all together so we don't have all this fragmentation. So I think the intent is to get to a spot where it's consistent. I think it's a challenge.
How many years do you see?
Oh, I mean, I'm intrigued to see what's in the COBIT 5 version, so everybody's hoping it's wrapped up in a year or two. That realistically, ITIL V3 is no longer V3, it's just ITIL. It's no longer the ITIL infrastructure library, it's just ITIL. So ITIL process framework and COBIT comes in more with the governance and good control frameworks. But it's evolving, so it's a challenge.
Robert, I want to ask you the same question about the same activity. What happens if we are involved in a customer situation, going with a client, that once what do you have to do? Recommend something to wait, or we have to start, or just now, the thing that we have now. All the things are open. ITIL refreshing, ISO 2006 refreshing, ISO 35 and COVID same. What is your recommendation in the case?
You know, a lot of my clients the question is, are you going to bite off the whole animal at once and try to do it all, or is there some kind of intermediate step that you can do this on? So a lot of the stats in the industry surveys say people are still just implementing ITIL V2 processes. So they're in the operation processes, change, config management, incident management, not even attempting the service strategy until the update to ITIL gets done, not doing too much of continual service improvement. So a lot of what I work with is, here's a roadmap of 5 years, let's just chunk it out into pieces and approach it a little more systemically. And I'm all about ROI. So I work with government agencies, so it's about the mission. We're much more about the mission and the politics than we are about the dollars. So the U.S. Navy is not as concerned about what the ROI is. They're concerned about, does it enable the mission, the warfighter mission. So my commercial clients are much more ROI oriented. So don't implement a process or update it just for the sake of doing it. There's got to be a business case. And I spend a lot of time on presentations around business case analysis, benchmarking, performance management frameworks. So I'm really into the measurement piece more than the do piece. So I'm not an IT professional. I'm really a management consultant. So I spend a lot of time on measuring it, processing it, and making it better. Not much on the technology side. So I think that's the piece. Prove me there's a business value to do it and do it in pieces. So that's my opinion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.